I want to take you back to 1958 when I was 16 years old, and Bobby Day had a big hit on the radio, Rockin' Robin, and I can just go right back singing that song. It'll just take me right back. So here goes. He rocks in the treetop all the day long, rockin' and a-boppin' and a-singing this song. All the little birds on Daybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, tweet, tweet. Rockin' Robin, rockin' Robin. We'll go rockin' Robin, 'cause you're really gonna rock tonight. Every little swallow, every chickadee, every little bird in the tall oak tree, the wise old owl, the big black crow, flap their wings singing, go bird go. Rockin' Robin, rockin' Robin. We'll go rockin' Robin, 'cause we're really gonna rock tonight. The pretty little raven at the bird bandstand taught him how to bop, and it was grand. They got her doing steady, and bless my soul, he out-bopped the buzzard in the oriole. He rocks in the treetop all day long, hoppin' and a-boppin' and singing this song. And all the little birds on Jaybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, tweet, tweet. Well, the pretty little raven and the bird bandstand taught him how to bop, and it was grand. They started going steady, and bless my soul, he out-bopped the buzzard in the oriole. Rockin' Robin, rockin' Robin. We'll go rockin' Robin, 'cause we're really gonna rock tonight. Well, he rocks in the treetop all the day long, hoppin' and a-boppin' and singing this song. And all the little birds on Jaybird Street love to hear the robin go tweet, tweet, tweet. Rockin' Robin, rockin' Robin. We'll go rockin' Robin, 'cause we're really gonna rock tonight. Tweedly-dee-dee-dee, tweedly-dee-dee, tweedly-dee-dee-dee. There we go. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did.